3 blows, 1 executioner, 1 prayer, which, they said, could be heard even after the silence. This is Mary Stuart's last night. A queen whom some called a traitor, others a saint. A woman whose life began with a crown and ended under the axe. The story will end 3 times. Are you ready to hear how an era was broken in 3 blows? The evening of February 7th, 1587. Fotheringay Castle, northern England. Mary was informed that the execution would take place in the morning. February 8th was the day of the execution. Behind the walls, fog, heavy as iron. Inside, a woman who has spent 20 years in prison and is now waiting for dawn. Once she was called the Queen of Scotland, the widow of France, the pretender to the English throne. Now she is just a prisoner of the state that was once her ally. She received the sentence a few days before her execution. It was signed by Elizabeth herself, her cousin, her rival, her mirror in power. No one knows what Mary felt that night. Chronicles say she prayed for a long time, kneeling, without fear. She had already gone through everything: exile, loss, humiliation. Now all that remained was to accept the silence. Would you be able to wait calmly for dawn, knowing that it would be your last? Mary Stuart was born in 1542, and 6 days after her birth, she became Queen of Scotland. Her father, King James V, died, leaving the throne to his infant daughter. The country was divided. Catholics fought Protestants, and the English tried to influence Scottish politics. To protect the child from political intrigues, she was sent to France, Scotland's ally. There she grew up at the court of the French king, surrounded by glamour, education, and intrigue. At the age of 16, Mary married the heir to the French crown, Francis, and briefly became Queen of France. But her happiness did not last long. A year later, Francis died, and the 17-year-old widow returned to Scotland. But the country she had left as a child had changed. The Protestant Reformation had already divided the state, and the Catholic queen became a stranger in her own capital. To strengthen her power, Mary married a second time, to Henry Darnley, a young Scottish lord who also had English royal roots. The marriage seemed like a perfect union. It united 2 thrones, Scottish and English, in the hands of one dynasty. But it turned out to be a disaster. Darnley was narcissistic, jealous, and cruel. A year later, he was already openly quarreling with the queen, demanding power, and then became the victim of a nighttime explosion in his own home. His death was the point of no return. Although there was no evidence, suspicion fell on Mary and her new favorite, the Earl of Bothwell. Their marriage after the tragedy only reinforced the rumors. The queen married her husband's murderer. Can power save a person if the people no longer believe in their innocence? The path upward turned into a fall. The subjects rebelled, and Mary was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her young son, James VI. She fled to England, seeking refuge with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth saw her not as a refugee, but as a rival. What is more frightening for a monarch, a foreign sword or a foreign crown? After all, Mary had a legitimate claim to the English throne. The same blood of the Tudor dynasty flowed in her veins. For the Catholics of Europe, it was Mary, not Elizabeth, who was the true Queen of England. And so, instead of refuge, she was given a prison. At first, she was kept under surveillance for her own safety. Then she was locked up for the sake of state stability. And eventually, simply because her existence was politically dangerous. 20 years in the prisons of English castles. Mary prayed, wrote letters, and embroidered. Sometimes, they say, she sang psalms in French. But no prayer could stop history. In 1586, a conspiracy broke out, an attempt by Catholics to kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Did she really know about it? There is little evidence. But for Protestant England, that was enough. It was this so-called Babington conspiracy that became the turning point. Letters between the conspirators were intercepted by agents of Secretary of State Francis Walsingham, the man who created one of the first spy networks in Europe. Mary's letters were carried out in the cork of a beer barrel. Gilbert Gifford planted them, and Thomas Phillips broke the codes. These letters allegedly contained Mary's own response, in which she approved the plan to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. This, yes, was enough to accuse her of treason under the new English Conspiracy Act of 1585, which provided for the death penalty for anyone who contributed to an attempt on the life of the monarch, even indirectly. After a short trial, where the verdict was determined before the hearing even began, Mary's fate was sealed. And when Elizabeth signed the death warrant, it was not a court decision. It was an act of fear of another queen who could no longer be broken. 20 years. That was how long her imprisonment lasted, between the stone walls of English castles, where time passed more slowly than faith. They say that at first she was treated with respect. She had chambers, servants, permission to correspond. But over the years, the chains of hospitality tightened. Letters began to be intercepted, visitors checked. The world that was once her kingdom narrowed to a few steps between the bed and the window. Imagine 20 years between two walls. How many thoughts can be locked away with the body? Maria remained queen even in prison. She rose at dawn, prayed, combed her thick dark hair, and ordered her maid to bring her a red dress. Red, the liturgical color of martyrdom, the color of faith. She knew that this day would come someday, and she wanted to meet it not in black, but in the colors of devotion. When the sentence was finally confirmed, she was allowed to choose what to wear before the world. She did not hesitate. A red dress, a black cloak, rosary beads in her hands, and a cross on her chest. That was her armor. Not for war, but for death. That night, according to witnesses, she did not sleep. She wrote a letter to Elizabeth, not with a curse, but with forgiveness. She wrote to her servants, asking them to pray. She wrote to Rome, even though she knew the letter would never arrive. In the morning, she ordered her hair to be combed and her wig pinned up so that she would look dignified. She asked for a mirror for the last time. "I die a queen," she said, "but as a woman, I forgive." Could you forgive the person who signed your death warrant? According to eyewitnesses, when the guards came for her, she was kneeling. She prayed in a whisper, and when their footsteps echoed in the corridor, she simply raised her head. Without fear. One maid cried. Another tried to remove the cross from her to hide it from the crowd. Mary replied quietly, "Leave it. It is my protection." She was let out of the cell, and during the short walk to the great hall, she did not turn around once. Eyewitnesses wrote that she smelled of incense and wax, like a church before Massachusetts. As she walked, her little dog, who had been living in the cell all this time, slipped out from under the bed and ran after her. The guard wanted to push him away, but Mary stopped him with a glance. "Let him be. He won't say anything." Before we begin, it is important to note, this is historical documentary material created for educational purposes. It contains descriptions of violence that are historical in nature. February 7th, 1587. The morning was cold and sunless. In the hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a wooden platform covered with black cloth was set up. On it was a chair, a prayer cushion, and an axe that glistened in the candlelight. Around it were several dozen people. Soldiers, officials, priests. Those who had come to enforce the law, and those who had come to make sure that it would indeed be carried out. When Mary entered, the hall fell silent. She walked slowly, holding a cross and rosary in her hands. Her face was calm, even bright. Eyewitnesses wrote that she did not look like a criminal, but like a person going to a ceremony. Two maids walked behind her, one carrying a pillow, the other a Bible. Under her heavy red dress, they say, was her little dog. It had run in there when she was being led from her cell, and no one dared to chase it away. When she climbed onto the scaffold, the priest offered her the opportunity to pray in English. She refused. "I pray in the language I was born with, French." Why? Even in the face of death, do people cling to their language more strongly than life itself? There was no defiance in her words, only dignity. She knelt down and touched the pillow. Some wrote that at that moment, everyone present lowered their gaze. Even the executioner, the one who was to raise the axe in a few minutes. She said a short prayer for her sister Elizabeth. May God forgive her. Then she took off her cloak, unfolded her dress, and under the red one was another, darker, like blood under the light of the torches. Someone cried. Someone crossed themselves hoarsely. And she smiled. "My sins are already forgiven," she said. When the executioner came closer, she laid her head on the pillow herself. The maids stood to the side, trembling. She whispered to them, "Don't be afraid. It will be quick." The crowd held its breath. History stood still, between two worlds. The executioner stood nearby, dressed in black, wearing a hood. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He had seen executions before, but never a queen. Mary laid her head on the pillow. The maid stepped back. One of them sobbed. The other fell to her knees and covered her face with her hands. The hall became so quiet that you could hear the wick crackling in the candle. Even those who had come with indifference suddenly felt that they had become part of something too big to simply get through. Are you ready for the moment when even time stands still? Because after that, there will be no turning back. The executioner raised his axe. The first blow missed. The blade only struck the back of her head. Silence. No one breathed. The second blow was dull and heavy. The head was almost severed. Someone in the crowd covered their mouth. Someone turned away. And only Mary, even at that moment, seemed calm, like a prayer that had not ended. The third blow was the final one. The head fell, and the executioner lifted it by the hair. "God save the Queen," he exclaimed. But at that very moment, the wig slipped off the head, and everyone saw gray, short hair. This moment was recorded in eyewitness accounts and later depicted in engravings, as a symbol of the debunking of the illusion of power. She died not as a young beauty, but as a woman whom time and prison had dried up to her very essence. A sigh swept through the hall, not from horror, but from shame. Even those who had signed the sentence could now not look at it without a shadow of doubt. And then, the quietest but most painful scene. Her little dog ran out from under her dress. He crawled up to the body and lay down next to it. They tried to pull the dog away, but he whimpered and would not leave. Eyewitnesses wrote. He lay beside her until the body was removed from the platform. They also wrote that they saw Maria's lips move for a few seconds after the blow. It was as if she was still whispering a prayer. Whether this was really the case, no one knows. Some swore it was a miracle. Others said it was just a nervous twitch. But this legend outlived executioners and kings, because every era wants to believe that words are stronger than death. After the third blow, the hall stood still for a few more seconds. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the sigh of one of the priests in the corner could be heard. The executioner lowered his axe. His hands were covered in blood, and he trembled as if he had awakened from a bad dream. The court clerk stepped forward and silently placed a sheet of paper on the platform, the official confirmation of the execution. His pen scratched the surface of the table, and the sound seemed louder to the people than any scream. Some cried. Some just stood with a blank stare, as if trying to comprehend what had happened. Those who had come as witnesses to state justice left as witnesses to something much more terrible. Can justice look festive, even if the executioner trembles? But rules were rules. Mary Stuart's body was covered with a cloth to hide the wounds and carried out of the hall. The dog did not leave until it was dragged away by force. Elizabeth's official representative came out to the crowd and read, "Justice has been done according to the will of the Queen. May God have mercy on her soul." No one responded, and in that silence was the whole truth. No one was happy. Witnesses later recalled, "We thought we would see a criminal, but we saw a woman dying with more dignity than we live." That evening, a public mass for her soul was banned. But in some castles in Scotland, priests read prayers in secret, behind closed doors. For even those who did not share her faith felt that it was not only the Queen who had been executed, but something more. After the execution, Elizabeth publicly protested and accused her secretary William Davison of rushing the execution. He was thrown into the Tower, and the Queen tried to convince everyone that she did not want her sister's death. The memory of honor, of dignity, of the line that power should not cross. A few days passed, and the events at Fotheringay began to take on a life of their own. Witnesses dispersed, letters were sent to London, Paris, and Rome. But everyone who saw the execution remembered it differently. And from these fragments of memory, a legend was born. Official reports preserved the bare facts. The blows of the axe, the red dress, the wig that flew off, the dog that did not leave the body. All this is documented. Even the names of those who stood closest to her are recorded in the protocol. But after a few weeks, the ambassadors' letters began to sound different. Some wrote that they saw her lips move for a few seconds after the last blow, like a prayer that would not die. Others swore that they saw a glow on her face, as if God had accepted her even before the axe fell. For some, this was a sign of holiness. For others, it was a political weapon. Catholics wrote about a martyr of the faith, Protestants about a conspirator who got what she deserved. and each side created its own Maria, a saint or a sinner, a victim or a threat. Who would you believe? The one who lost, or the one who wrote the chronicle? The chroniclers described even the smallest details, the color of the candles, the shape of the pillow, the executioner's reaction, because they understood that this scene would become history. And it did. As early as the 17th century, her death was depicted in engravings, acted out in dramas, and sung about in ballads. And the red dress became a symbol forever, not of royal pride, but of quiet courage. Interestingly, some of the most famous miracles were attributed to her much later. The movement of her lips was first mentioned only decades later, in French pamphlets, where her death was described as a prayer that continued after the body. And the dog, that little spaniel, became an almost mythical image. The motif of a small dog under a dress is well known, but sources differ. In the podcast, present it as a common legend. Artists painted it next to her body, as if it were the embodiment of a loyalty that humans do not possess. But even if some of this is fiction, legends always contain a truth that is greater than the facts, because they preserve not only the event, but also the feeling it left behind. Mary Stuart died one morning at Fotheringhay Castle, but her image lives on to this day, and each generation sees something different in her. Catholics see a martyr, Protestants see a warning, and historians see a person who paid the price for being born a queen at the wrong time. So what do you think actually fell that morning? The queen's head or the belief in justice? 3 blows. The first, a human error. The second, a mistake of history. The third, the final one. But even after that, the echo of prayer could still be heard for a long time. Not because it was actually heard, but because every era wants to believe that words can outlive the sword. Mary Stuart died more than 4 centuries ago. But every time fear is more important than justice. When the authorities fear their own shadow. When the court turns into a political spectacle. Because history always repeats its blows. Only the names change. Because every era has its executioners and its queens. And each of them decides who to call a criminal and who to call a martyr. Dignity does not require a crown. And even if the sword has fallen, the memory of how a person met their final blow makes them immortal.